everybody says media's changing, media's changing. It is. But one thing that hasn't changed, I mean, why do people listen to any podcast for that matter? But why is Dan Le Batard's show is popular? The Morning After is popular. All these shows that people listen. Why? It's just people bantering. It's conversation. That hasn't changed. So everybody says, "Oh, it's media's dead." It's like, no, it's all still people in their car, listening on their earbuds or whatever. They're listening to conversation. It might be from the New York Times. It might be a comedian. It might be a politician or whatever. That to me that hasn't changed. People are still flipping the radio on or putting on an iPad because if as long as it's entertaining banter, they're going to tune in.
Yeah, that's what I love about YouTube and podcast also. It's very motivating because you have a scoreboard. It's almost like the stock market, really. You can look at any second during the day and see how many views you're getting and thus how much money you'll make. And like you said, to me, it's the essence of it all is storytelling. It's telling a great story. And so this kind of goes back to the William Byron thing I mentioned earlier. William
We
Byron
get it.
of
We get it.
NASCAR.
Charlie's friends with the Daytona 500 winner. I get it. Okay. See,
No, but what I'm saying though is like, here's a guy who's a young, good-looking kid. He's one of the best drivers in NASCAR. He just won the Daytona 500. I knew this. This video, this podcast is not going to do that well. And it's just because it's nothing anyone did wrong, right? He's just kind of a guy. He's not super controversial. He's not going to say something real spicy. And I always find that interesting. It could be somebody who doesn't have the big name, but they're interesting and they tell compelling stories. And I always find that fascinating how you could have a big name person, but that video doesn't perform. But you could have Joe Blow from Kokomo, but if they have a really good story, you see that. And people, when you have a good story on YouTube or podcast, people like it, they subscribe off it, they comment, and that's that whole algorithm thing. It's just and now we kind of know, like, you've been in this game a long time. You know when you get a good soundbite. And when I hear a soundbite, I'm like, that's something that if you package it the right way is super interesting, regardless if the person is famous or not. But there's some people who are really famous, but they do a podcast for an hour and they really don't say that much. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's what I find interesting about this game. And I'm telling you, it's addicting because I look at my analytics every day, probably 100 times. And when you see that views climbing like a mountain, meaning every minute, every hour, more people are watching, it gets to be kind of addicting.
well, and it's fun when people say I couldn't get out of the car if it was a radio interview or the Kelly Chase interview. I put it on the podcast as well, and people said, "Oh my God, I listened to the whole thing," which 29 minutes. Like, wow, that's the greatest compliment. We should have next week. Let's get Joe Blow from Kokomo on. You've probably been texting with him late at night. Get him on the show.